All right, excellent. Well, today we're going to talk about how investor demand has led to a rethinking of sustainability strategy amongst property companies. And today, especially, we want to focus on the drivers behind sustainability action and how those drivers are changing. What is the value of ESG, environmental, social, and governance from a property perspective, and how are companies like ours managing risk and capturing this opportunity in this space? My name is Keagan Rubel, and I'm the Sustainability Director for CBRE. And today I'm thankful to be joined with Esther, Chief Sustainability Officer of City Developments, Tom Miller, Head of Development and Sustainability for LaSalle, Carmen, Director of Sustainability for the Langham Hospitality Group, and Phil Cowling, Chief Sustainability Officer, Cromwell Property Group. So I'd just like to jump right into it and ask, I'd like to first start with Tom and ask about how sustainability drivers are acting upon organizations like ours to change company behavior. And before I do that, I just want to frame that question with the fact that we're seeing a lot of legislative and attitude changes happening across APAC. As I'm sure you're aware, we recently had New Zealand announce a new law requiring financial firms to assess and disclose not only their own financial risk to climate change, but also that of companies that they're lending money to. Right? That's a big change. It's a world first. We have China, formalizing its cap and trade system and pushing an ambitious green 5-year plan. Countries all across APAC making carbon reduction commitments as part of the Paris Accord, and on, right? From 5 years ago, the level of focus and attention on climate change we're seeing is quite significantly stepped up, right? So I'd like to ask you, Tom, how are legislative and or other drivers across APAC trickling down into the property sector and impacting sustainability decisions and leadership from your perspective, Tom?
Well, just going back a step, just a couple of years ago, the ESG drivers for us as a private equity real estate firm were driven a lot by our investors' general ideas that they wanted to have more sustainable investments. And so we were, our ESG programs developed along, and like everybody else's did. And it's only been about the last year and a half that with the climate commitments that people are making to go net zero carbon by 2050, and the regulations that are starting to fall as a part of that, or at least be developed as part of that, are the real drivers here. We as an international firm, have investors from all over the place investing in our various platforms all over the place as well. So here in Asia, we have a lot of European investors. And the thing that's really catching us this year, and we're spending a lot of time on, is this SFDR that's happening in Europe. This Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation. It is a huge commitment and driver in the sense that if you don't do it, you're severely penalized. So we're finding that the regulations that are starting to happen worldwide are affecting our investors who are asking us to do more, but also affecting us directly as we market and set up our products. So now it's a combination of investor drive along with regulatory drive that basically says, you can't afford not to be doing this very well now. Whereas a few years ago, you could kind of wink and nod, not do as much as you may have wanted to. Now you have to.
Sure. So compliance, and it sounds like, as you mentioned, you're now tying those messages into the marketing. So does that mean that you're emphasizing the sustainability aspects of your respective investments, so that it's already taking the box of potential investors that at least they know you have that covered for them?
Yeah, well, we have a range of different products, and we offer products that have more of a focus on ESG than others, because there's still a market for investors out there that they want you to meet regulations, but they don't want to go overboard on it. And then there's the other ones that impact investing and everything else. They just want to be an investable in the investable space. So we, as a global firm, tailor our products for those various investor pools of money that are out there. But generally, overall, the entire all of our portfolios are moving along the ESG curve higher than they would have been, say, 2 or 3 years ago, and you can't really ignore it anywhere, given the regulations that are happening, and more so, there are big pools of money that only want to be in the well-run ESG space. So
absolutely
catering to that as well.
Absolutely. Interesting. Well, there's a lot to unpack in there, and I might come back to you on some of those topics. But
Sure.
Esther, how similar are the sustainability drivers that Tom mentioned, from a compliance perspective, from a market perspective? How similar are those to the types of, external pressures, say, that you're facing within your organization at City Developments?
Yeah, thank you for the question and thank you for having me. And I totally agree with that. Well, we are all talking about the so-called stakeholder capitalism now. We are not just looking at in a good old day when I first started the journey more than 20 years ago, we look at risk management, how to mitigate risk, for reputation and all. But today we are not looking at mitigation alone. That is given. We have to look at adaptation. We have to look at the multi-stakeholder, what are their expectations and what are their fast changing requirements. Okay, whether it is regulator, we have already talked about it. And I'm sure if you want to change things, regulation come in, immediately you will have to comply. And otherwise you will lose your license to operate. So regulation remains as one of the key drivers. But I think now we are not looking at just, the policymaker, but we're also looking, investor, very, very important, money talks. Okay, they control the funding, all of us are in the business that we need financial, we need financing support. We also need to attract ESG investors. And both are really growing, by, exponentially last year. So these are the two key drivers that along the value chain. If I look at the whole holistic cycle from acquisition to design, building, and management, and selling it and management, manage all the spaces, whether it's residential, commercial, property, and all that. There are key drivers along the way. Okay, so of course, when you even acquire land in Singapore, there are certain requirements, like you have to use like PPVC, technology, to look at, some of the key land. Otherwise, you can't even, get near it. And also you have to, comply with, the green mark and, standard. And we are not looking at just, basic certification level. We have to look at like super low energy. We have to look at, the higher level of green mark. So even for consumers nowadays, when a good old day, when we launch our green, residential home, eco condo 20 years ago, a lot of people are just like, oh, okay, just look at the pricing, look at location. They don't even look at what are the green features that we offer. But today it's a very different ballgame. Every property we sell, we actually, after 6 months, we normally do a survey. So now you can really see that green features as creeping up to the, one of the top, consideration. May not be number one, number two, number three, but they are creeping up. So I think we are looking at, a fast growing, the so-called millennial or even Gen Z generation, that they will expect and require, green feature. And same for like even attracting talents. So now we are in the market that sustainability professional are the hottest, assets. So the supply and demand is so crazily different that we always have to tie my good staff, on the chair and don't let them poach, be poached by others. So are we going to attract such, eco-conscious, talent and people? So there's just so many drivers now. And I think in the end of the day, last year, it accelerated all these, consideration. And we are now very convinced that the world is convinced that the health of the planet is actually interconnected with the health of people, business, economy. So I think if businesses are still asking for why, I think they are going to be, screened out very soon. Yeah.
Well, we have that. I have that question saved for later in terms of what we think businesses or companies are doing wrong, and it sounds like if they're asking why, that's one of the answers. That's really interesting, Esther. So we talked about legislation as a driver, investors, similar to as Tom mentioned, changing consumer behaviors, talent attraction and retention. Absolutely. It certainly is an interesting landscape, and I like that you mentioned mitigation. We don't talk a lot about mitigation. I think for the sake of time, I'd like to move it on and hear Phil's perspective in terms of drivers from his side. But if we have time in the end, I'd like to loop back and understand how sort of the mitigation from a property perspective fits into your overall strategy. But for now, Phil, I'll pass it over to you. What are you seeing from your perspective as Chief Sustainability Officer?
Yeah, thanks, Keagan. So I think, look, obviously got to agree with Tom and Esther, but I think, my own personal view is that, every year for a number of years, we sort of sat down and gone, what, I think this year is going to be a really big fundamental change point, and we're going to really see things coming through. The reality is, I think, for a number of years now, 4 or 5 or even more, we've just seen this, accelerating exponential rise in demand, and the demand is what's leading to legislation, and the legislation is what's leading to action, and you have to sort of go, this isn't about companies competing anymore. This is about governments and countries now recognizing that they have voters they've got to respond to, they have bigger obligations they've got to address as a government. And I think finally, as a sustainability professional, you can sort of go, what, the dots are finally being joined together, and people are finally realizing that it isn't about this number of discrete things you do because you can, or because it's nice to do, or because there's a market in play, but actually the whole darn thing is linked. And I think that, whilst it's been said a lot, I really believe that finally people are realizing that actually strong sustainability performance is the counterbalance, not to risk, but to investment risk. And whether you're investing in infrastructure, people, or all the things that you just mentioned, Keagan, sustainability in its widest context is now recognized as being a fundamental driving force for good. And what we've started talking about in Australia and just sort of teams in Europe now as well is, we've long been happy and very comfortable with this sort of logic of trying to justify a balance sheet, an investment sheet, a development return sheet. Now I think what we're talking about is an environmental balance sheet. And people are beginning to realise that, these decisions all play a part in an environmental balance sheet. What you do, the impact it has on people, place and planet, the fact that you've got to try and create this circular economy, etc. Suddenly I find I'm in far more interesting conversations than, explain to me what you're going to do about your energy. Now people are talking about what does net zero mean, and how are we going to get there, and how are we going to get our scope 3 there, and these things that previously, people would just go blank in their eyes and walk away. We're now getting investors, financiers, tenants, and boards saying, tell me what you're going to do about this, because it's becoming important. We need to be able to do it. So I do believe that perhaps one of the ironies of COVID is, it will be seen as one of these transformative years for a bunch of things, but I also think it's going to be seen as one of the years that was at the beginning of this massive change to recognise that we really do only have one planet. We've only got one sort of race that's called the human race, and we better start looking after both.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love that. That really resonates with me, especially your point about the environmental balance sheet, both from an organizational perspective and a country perspective. I think a lot of people sitting outside of APAC, and it's easy to criticize some of the relative to Europe, relative to parts of the Americas, slower action from a sustainability perspective out here. But now we're seeing our governments, I should say, really beginning to get it and take action, and in some cases quite aggressively. In some cases have been doing so for a long time and just haven't really been fully appreciated. And they're doing that for their own self-interest because of the vulnerabilities that climate change has on them. And same for the companies. Back to your point about, they need to be accountable to up and coming, to their shareholders, as well as to their staff. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think those are very powerful, and perhaps that we can put that in the bucket of if companies are ignoring that, they're doing something wrong as well.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, that was it. That's all I had, Keagan. So
there you go. Okay. Well, we'll hopefully loop back to that and put you on the spot for some more later. And Carmen, I want to turn it over to you. I think from your perspective, it's a little bit different. From a hospitality group, I imagine you're having a different dynamic, a different sort of business ecosystem than those that we have just discussed here. Tell us a little bit about, what pressures are you facing? What is it from Cromwell, from the Langham Hospitality Group's perspective?
Yeah, truly it's quite different for us because Langham Hospitality Group is a wholly owned subsidiary of our Great Eagles. So comparatively, investor regulators may have less pressure on us. But however, we've been doing this for a decade, and it's mainly, I think at the beginning, we start out actually from our staff that, because understanding hospitality hotels, we actually is quite I would say a labor intensive. We have a lot of staff in the hotel. So they demand that for more sustainability action of the company started out almost 10 years ago. And then later on that we find out that actually our guests also asking for more. So I think in particular, I would say in very specific year in 2018, when everyone, I think the whole world is looking at the plastic and then the straw. And then I think that is almost the very first time, to be honest, a general manager was telling me that it's the very first time the general manager of a hotel coming together to discuss a straw, the plastic straw. and then it's really because for us, we are guest facing, our staff is getting, so we've been and we know that it's come much quicker, like what Esther said, it's just come right away. I mean, this today, then we're serving plastic straw, we might get complaint from our guests saying why are you still using a plastic straw? And then we actually have to explain, and we need to source other alternatives, and perhaps that tomorrow or the day after we need to switch it already. And this actually give us a kind of a really alert that actually we need to react much quicker in the next decade or so, and we need to push ourselves to look more in the long term with more aspiration, goal setting, the beautiful background Esther have, the SDGs and etc. But then we need to translate all these into the company, into an actions. So that we've been talking a lot about strategy, policies, and setting goals. But I think it's almost a time now. Okay, we need solutions, we need actions, we need to put all this strategy in place. So it's a very interesting moment for us. And then we also it's our first time that to put on a 10-year strategy with a very solid goals. And for hospitality, when we talk about net zero, and it's not simply just talking about energy. We actually serving food as well. And so plant-based becomes a important topic. We started, and we also through this F&B business, we started promoting vegetarian Green Monday since 2013, but it wasn't we've been doing this and we feel the difference from the perspective or the receipts from our customers. Nowadays they ask for more and ask for different type of food, and more people are accepting maybe not only Green Monday, but maybe at least one meal a day or even a couple of days, a week, we'll have more veggies. So we need to offer these options, and we know that it's also again is coming, and it could come quick as well as everyone came through last year, and health conscious is very important. People are really care about what they're eating inside their body, and all this combined that will just, I think is now the time everyone in the business, in the hotel, and actually for hotel is actually every functions, everyone that need to be on board on sustainability and start to put on then different offerings to our customers.
Interesting. That's really fascinating. And yeah, I agree. There's been an incredible upheaval of all things single-use plastic and straw removal, which has been great, very powerful and very important because they're so persistent in our natural ecosystems. I've seen recently this show Seaspiracy on Netflix.
Yes.
I'm sure you guys have seen as well, and it's really quite eye-opening. And the role seafood plays, and certainly a plant-based diet being calorie for calorie so much less carbon intensive, then absolutely I think that really resonates with me, what you said. Are you, from your perspective, making any sort of business model changes, or maybe that's too grandiose of a word, potentially any sustainability specific offerings to your customers? So for example, being sustainable to get more points, or some such.
I think we started out, I think we still need to start out that by the actions that we can control. So for example, and it's an interesting journey for us, that looking at our guest room amenities. So the shampoo, shower gel. So we started out the discussion to phasing out those single-use disposable type of tubes in our room 2 years ago. And it's an initiative driven by our CEO, because we are a luxury brand. So how we not providing a truly, it's very challenging to how to state a truly sustainable options for our customers, and we cannot sacrifice the luxury and the quality view. So it took us quite some time, and finally we now agree that we will have some partnerships, so we will phase out everything, the single-use plastic in our guest room. So the shampoo, shower gel, or including those toothbrush, combs, we also look at the packaging as well. But I know that it's not yet the end, because when we started out the plastic, we now just check out the bulky item. But when we started looking at, there's some other small little items disposable in the hotel, and it's actually bring us to think back. Okay, I think at the beginning, when we're making the decision on buying something, how we make the decision that is including sustainability is very important. And that's the decision actually, that's the concept actually we need to translate to everyone, all the decision maker in the company, in a trash bag. So the person who determined buying the trash bag, is it sustainable as well? So I think it's we started doing that, and then
Sure.
But we need to move faster.
Sure, absolutely. Well, that's very interesting. And before I move on to talk a bit about net zero, and I want to ask Esther in terms of her journey and whether that's enough. But before I do, I just want to say, Carmen, that first of all, I can imagine that the challenges that you face in your industry to be sustainable within the hospitality industry, where you may go to a property to get that sense of decadence, of luxury. And in some cases you want to see, or some people may get value from seeing a large, unnecessarily large quantity of food options, for example, or, the ability to be, to have that sort of freedom from, freedom of increased choices. And so I don't envy you that challenge, but it sounds like you're going about it the right way. And certainly I think, making sustainability relevant to your guests, that was another point that resonated with me. From a commercial sort of facilities management perspective, that's something that we struggle with in CBRE is, we want to, yes, optimize that HVAC system. Yes, make sure we're procuring renewable electricity. Yes, managing our carbon footprint down. But is that really reaching through and touching staff and impacting their daily experience? And that's where we sort of get into things around zero waste aspirations and other sustainability elements that may be more relevant. But anyway, thanks for sharing that. Sounds like a fascinating journey, but admittedly one I don't envy you to have, because it sounds very difficult. And Esther, in terms of net zero, this is a big topic for now, not the last couple of years. It's been a hot topic for a while now, and we have some organizations like Microsoft that have now making these broad sweeping statements around being net zero through the life of their organization, right? No longer just for that year, but through to since their organization was established. We're seeing before companies and organizations could differentiate from claiming that they're net zero. And now we're seeing that that competition getting to, an even more fervent level. While on the other hand, there's a lot of criticism around offsets, for example, and that, is this not just sort of an illegitimate method to buy your way out of sustainability? And so, I wanted to sort of leave that as an open-ended question for you, Esther. What is your, how does net zero sit with you in your organization? And I know you've been making some bold commitments around that space, but also, is it enough?
Well, I think for us, I mean, we are very fortunate that we started our sustainability journey early. I would share that. I mean, you're not the only questions that we face. We always, that there are already journalists is asking, they say, why is property companies are so forthcoming about claiming net zero? Is there any greenwashing element in it and all that? I mean, I don't blame them. So for us, we honestly, it is really a journey. You don't start with like, tomorrow I wake up, I want to achieve net zero. What we did is we started climate change, policy. We started tracking our performance and all that as far back as 2008, when we published the first sustainability report. And then we look at, really climate change and carbon management strategies and policy. You really have to track it and also look at what exactly are we talking about? I would have some doubts that if a company just come out and say that I will turn a net zero by 2030 of the whole company and all that, or absorbing all the, supply chain, the embodied carbon, I would have doubt if I have like, 1,000 tenants. If you have a shop that is selling carpet, for example, how do I know that the data they provide to me are validated? There's hundreds of carpet in his shop. Are you saying that every piece I have to walk in and do a carbon audit? I think it is really, quite far-fetched if you ask me. So what we did is like, okay, we started a climate strategy, we set target and goals, and then we look at SBTI. In 2018, we actually committed, took me 8 months, okay, to get SBTI to stamp on it that, yes, okay, this target is what we can, accept, and it will help you drive change. So that one was 2018, in August. Okay, it's not easy. You must base on science. You can't just wake up, hey, Keagan, tomorrow I'm going to net zero, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to support it. And today the world is very transparent. And all the sustainability report you have to, best practice is requiring you to audit by external auditor. So nothing is like, go hush hush under the table. So, and then of course in February we make a really bold pledge. Again, it took us months to work on it with World GBC, World Green Building Council. As property, of course, we look at World Green Building Council advancing net zero as like a benchmark. So we follow all the criteria, the KPIs, and then we look at it in a very prudent manner. I cannot promise you everything under the sun. We are operating in 29 countries. If I tell you I can do it, it will not be very, convincing. So we are doing it step by step in a prudent manner. I am actually committed to, the operational net zero for properties that is under our direct control and management. Then you can really track it and also share data in a truthful manner. I cannot tell you that I can absorb all the embodied carbon of all my tenants, all my suppliers. It's huge. I salute those that who dare to make that pledge. Okay,
Absolutely,
and 2030 is not that far away. Okay, yeah, before I knew it, I thought I started in 1995. It was a long time ago, but I can still remember everything that I started the journey. I still have contractors scolding me. I still remember how they scold me. So I think now today is a very different ballgame altogether. When you say that you want to pledge to commit to something, you better have data to support it. So for us, it's really a journey. From SBTI is very tough. And in fact, when we committed to SBTI in 2018 was based on 2-degree scenario. Now IPCC asking for 1.5. So now we are actually adjusting it, looking at 1.5 degree, warmer scenario, which is already a big challenge. And of course, over and above, we want to push it, because in order to achieve that 1.5, in a way, you have to really pledge for a net zero by 2030 already, at least for the direct, operational carbon footprint. So all these are intertwined. And then all this you must support with data. So, I mean, I have actually talked to quite a few reporter and analysts, and all of them are very convinced now that how we calculate it. And tomorrow, my sustainability report is going, online. So take a look at it, and we embrace not just GRI as the core since 2008. We actually included, TCFD and embrace SBTI, carbon CDP, and then SASB 2 years ago, and then this year with the climate disclosure standard as well. So all these are actually the benchmark, and all these are assessors. So you can't, I don't know how people can run away, if you just claim something and you cannot, provide. And of course, last but not least, I mean, the letter from Larry Fink, every year is raising the bar. So this year, it's not just saying that you have to achieve low carbon. He make it very clear that they will, expect investee company to disclose their net zero emission strategy and goal. So specific, not just about low carbon, but net zero strategy. Absolutely. So otherwise, you are going to be, to risk being, screened out from all these big investors. So BlackRock is the largest in the world, but there are also a lot of big investors also breathing in the same breath. So I think it is very hard. It's like this also linked to the risk mitigation. If you still want to get a share of this growing pie of ESG, investment, trillions of dollars and all that, so you better dish out a very good ESG report.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Esther, you don't sound busy at all.
I only sleep 4 or 5 hours a night, so busy.
Before I pass it to Tom, I wanted to ask you, Esther, just one thing, just a quick, short and sharp response. What is the main sort of blockage, if anything, to progress, to your progress to deliver on some of these? Just a quick one, and then we'll pass to Tom.
Okay, I mean, I'm very fortunate that we have very strong board leadership, but I can also tell you that along the value chain, there are still lack of really clear understanding of what net zero is all about, what embodied carbon is all about. So you still need to raise the awareness and knowledge, and with awareness, we hope that there will be more action, and then with action, there will be impact. But for now, I would still say that the leaders, it's like a pyramid. The leaders are at the tip, which is very small. And then the bulk of the pyramid are still people who may not know, may not understand, or may not care, some of them. So I think this is still a challenge to change the mindset, to get everybody on board and drive the change that we want. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And certainly an understanding and awareness. At the end of the day, people tend to want to be on the right side of history. And I think sustainability from a certain perspective, it's the type of stewardship that we have in our own lives, but projecting that and extending that time frame geographically and temporally. Before I asked Thomas a similar question around how net zero fits within his organization, I just wanted to mention also on the point where you talked about that shifting from 2.0 degrees ambition for science-based target down to 1.5 degrees warming allowance. And I think that figure is very interesting, and often talking about sort of awareness, one that's frequently misunderstood, because although that is the allowance for the average global temperature increase, that global temperature increase happens very unevenly from a geographic perspective. So you're actually getting less change happening at the equator, and most of that change is happening at the poles. And when you get that increased 5-6% centigrade change at the poles, you're shrinking that ice cap, you're getting that less reflectivity, you're releasing the methane in that ice cap, and you get these negative feedback loops that I think are certainly very worrisome. And therefore, I really applaud your effort to ratchet that up and hit that 1.5 degrees, because it's not just about feeling slightly more or less comfortable as we adjust our AC. It's really a massive difference for very vulnerable ecosystems within our globe and within our Earth. And so, Tom, over to you. In terms of, from an organizational perspective, how does how does net zero, on that concept of net zero, sort of fit within your strategy, or does it?
Well, no, it does, and it's we as a fund manager, we have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize the return to our investors. And within the last year and a half, when net zero carbon came to the fore in more of a, an operational issue, we came to the realization, maybe slower than some others, who knows, but the value that we're trying to create for our investors will be linked very strongly to the net zero carbon progress that we make over the next 5, 10, 15 years, to the point where we're fairly confident that in 5, 6, 7 years from now, when you go to sell a property, if you don't have a good net zero carbon story attached to that property to tell the purchaser how this asset is going to make a net zero carbon at 2050 or whatever, that you'll have less value when you go to sell it. So positioning an asset to sell with a good net zero carbon story, saying what we've done so far, what we think needs to be done, this is the pathway that we think it's going to go on, will be a value add to the sale price. And therefore, we've been able to tie it to, we will be able to tie it, we're doing it now, but we'll do some more as the years go on, to as a package thing to show that value is being created because you have a net zero carbon plan. Those that don't have a net zero carbon plan, I think will be discounted. I mean, I think the sale price will be discounted because whoever gets it, the last thing they want to do is fall on the wrong side of one of their net zero carbon obligations, be it regulation or the CREM curves or whatever, and they're going to have to figure it all out. And that will be an uncertainty to them that they're not going to want to pay for. So I think it's getting linked very closely to an integral part of how we do our investments.
Interesting, and a lot of very valid points around managing uncertainty, and having that coherent flight path in terms and long-term vision. And I would imagine from a leadership perspective within those organizations that you're investing within, that I wonder, and I'll put this question back to you. This is maybe getting a bit overly theoretical, but do you think that, as organizations stretch their thinking, beyond just the 1 quarter return and stock price through to sort of 10-year timeframes and product developments and, changes in legislation and user behavior over such longer periods of time, do you think that this is impacting leadership and management styles? Just a theoretical one. I'm interested in your perspective.
Are you talking about from within companies like us, like LaSalle, or
yes,
from our investors that are the people giving it? Because from an investor's perspective, they very much take the long term on these things.
Sure.
I mean, I think I read this, about 80% of the buildings that are going to be existing in 2050 have already been built. Okay, they're already here. Okay, and if those are going to go from 150 kilowatt hours per meter squared down to 40 in that period, you really have to have a plan to do that. Because if you don't follow that curve, you're going to, as they say, have a stranded asset out there, something you can't either lease or sell or whatever. And you don't want that in our business. You don't want to have an asset that's worth $100 million one day and worth nothing the next. Okay, you won't get any gold stars. So yes, it changes management's behavior, because then they start to realize that the net zero carbon pathway for this thing is as important as the market that we're going to try to attract, as our tenants and everything else. Because if you don't have that, you can lose value, and we do not like to lose value in our business.
Absolutely. And do you see big differences in quality of planning, or are you feeling that companies are generally getting it?
Everybody's kind of getting the whole idea, the big picture idea, but how that goes down to individual asset plans and everything else, they're still on the very front edge of that. Okay, as are most people, and we still have 3 or 4 years to get us to how that's going to be worked out on individual assets, but it's coming. And I think those plans are going to be invaluable as part of the sale or the purchase of an asset. If we're looking for an asset that's going to have great returns, I'm going to start looking for, where's your net zero carbon plan on this thing? Because I don't want to buy an asset that gets stuck in 2 or 3 years with regulatory issues because of the pathway that the country is committed to. So yeah, it is coming, and everybody's kind of on the front end of it, but it's going to be developing very quickly. And especially, we go back to the embodied carbon side. As the embodied carbon world starts to be able to easily get information as to what embodied carbon each of the items that I'm building has, that will become a huge and very quickly will turn into an area where you have to address it. You have to either, and I'm in my book, that means that new developments will become increasingly more difficult to justify. Whereas refurbishing those 80% of those buildings that are already built will become much more advantageous, because you don't have a huge carbon thing that you're trying to offset. okay, because it's already built and it's already in the past. So I think it'll change what we invest in. It will revitalize a lot of old buildings, which is good. It'll keep, the tear downs and rebuilds to, only in key areas or something, but most of the time if you can reuse an existing building, I think is going to be a great trend for the real estate industry. So all of those things moving forwards are a result of this net zero carbon, venture that we're all on.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. That's fascinating, frankly, and that increased information and transparency to really change priorities and how assets are valued at the end of the day. I think that's, as you were talking about, you reusing those brownfield spaces, that's brilliant. In the previous city that I lived in Asia, and since I'm going to pick on it, I won't call it out. There was a common practice to build to blast, not build to last. And a building would get torn down after 10 years, and it was a tragedy. But then it was built then in anticipation of that, and so it was just this negative cycle again. So I think that's absolutely the right approach when you can start to capture that embodied carbon within the actual building itself, and then have wrap legislation, wrap stakeholder demands around how that's managed and treated. I think that would be that's a huge missing piece of the puzzle. Absolutely. Thanks for that. And Phil, how does what Tom said resonate with you? How does net zero sit within Cromwell Property Group?
Yeah, so look, I think we've tried to sort of cut it into bite-sized chunks, and for some of the reasons Esther said, which is it's a huge problem, it's a huge challenge, and how there's the old adage of how do you eat an elephant, bite at a time. So, our corporate operations, we've been net zero for 3 years now in all our corporate operations, international flights, everything we do corporately. So we got there, we got that all accredited through an Australian federal scheme, so that's pretty good. Our European offices, the biggest struggle we've had there is trying to find a similar accredited national standard. When you're looking at 15 countries, that gets a bit tricky, but we're working on that. So we'll be there hopefully year after next. COVID sort of got in the way for this year. From a property perspective, very much like Tom said, the irony is I don't know a single property owner in the world today who knows what they're going to own in 2030. And if they do, it's because they own it now and they're intended to keep it. And so the reality is everything we're looking at today isn't net zero. There's very few. So the opportunity to get those buildings to net zero, again, if you're not careful, you can create a problem. We've got embodied carbon, we've got embodied use, we've got life cycle issues that, to some extent, you've got a challenge if you just start pulling things out to try and get better. And the reality is, beyond that, the technology at the moment is very limited when you start looking at buildings that are, being built even today, in order to say, I can make this thing stand alone, 100% self-sufficient and net zero. So we've got to start looking at infrastructure, renewable energy in the grid. We've got to recognise that we've got to start offsetting those things. But I also think we've got to recognise that offsetting is not a bad word. Again, if you look at this balance sheet, if you take, we've only got one planet, and if the whole planet gets to a zero, then we've done what we needed to do. So, the way you get there has to be sensible, and it has to be logical. In Australia, pretty much everything in our supply network is going to be past its sell-by date, end of life cycle, and redundant in the next 10 to 15 years. So the opportunity to invest in renewables, to invest in wind, to invest in really sits there, because it's now demonstrably cheaper than building a coal-fired power station. That recognition's got to come. And so I think it's not just about owning the property and having the problem yourself. It's got to be the balance of a smart pathway and a flexible one that responds to the future. And to some extent, as Tom said, I think it's one thing banging the drum and saying where you sit, but what people and investors will be looking for in the future is, yes, but can you continue on that pathway? And is there a finite end, or is there a solution that can take us through to an end that means we have resilience in our investment and security to know that that this investment, this product is going to be around? And I think that same thing applies for tenants as well. They want to know that the building they're trying to attract Gen Z talent into is going to meet the requirements of people that will be far more focused and far more judgmental on what their masters and employers are going to provide them. So I think it's a big challenge, but I think it's there, and I think it's there to be done. I also think that that net zero pathway, there really will be winners and there really will be losers. But if you really embrace the ESG, logic and strategy, the theory around stranded assets is about, resilience is about surviving, being around. What we're trying to say is, no, actually resilience is about thriving. It's about finding opportunity and actually really being a winner out of that stuff. You can do good and do well. They're not mutually exclusive. And that's the message we've got to keep banging the drum on, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great message, very powerful. The resilience is not just about surviving, but also thriving. That's that's a tagline. I might have to borrow that one in the future. Look, I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, for those of you watching, if you have any questions, feel free to drop that in the chat function. I'll just mention now, and we'll get to that in about 10 minutes or a little less. And before I move on and sort of ask my favorite question in this space, which I alluded to earlier, which is, what are companies doing wrong in this space? And just sort of one thought or sort of parting area that you might that we might consider as a group here. But before I do that, I want to ask Esther a question, because we were sort of chatting about this before we got started, and it's related to COVID, and it's sort of a selfish question, because I'm grappling with it within my organization as well, in terms of now we have this new normal evolving into a certain percentage of staff working from home more frequently, and it begs the question, when we're talking about managing our own operational footprints, our own scope 1, scope 2, and potentially even scope 3 footprints, how are we then accounting for and managing staff working from home? And I read a recent article, for example, by Ofcom that was saying that pre-COVID time, just emails, not all before we were addicted to Zoom, just emails is per an average user is generating about 125 kilograms of emissions per year. And I must say that was a real surprise to me. I didn't think it would have been that high. That's equivalent of about 320 kilometers of driving time. So I guess, Esther, you mentioned that you've been reading some interesting reports on that topic recently as well. It's an emerging topic. I don't think we're going to solve it here on this call, but just a couple of points. What are your thoughts about that?
Of course, 2020 during the lockdown, for corporate, our carbon footprint has come down. Every year we do measure our local traveling of employees and back, go to and fro, work between office and home. And we also report our overseas business travel with including accommodation stay and all that. Of course, last year during lockdown, our reduction of local traveling is almost like 57%. And then, overseas traveling is down by about 80%, because nobody can travel anyway, or literally, or just very few people can travel. And then, scope 3 actually also have come down quite a fair bit, and that is mainly talking about the electricity upstream emission, distribution and transmission of losses and courier services and all that. So basically, but that last year's data are not really the normal data. But then I bet, your question about how do we account for individuals' carbon footprint? Because we can't go to your home and Keagan tell me what is your carbon footprint, and yeah, I can't do that. So while we can record it, a lower carbon footprint on the corporate level, I don't have the data of what they use at home and how they travel at home, on how many, Grab delivery they have ordered, or e-commerce and all that. So that will really go round and round, and there's no end to it, because even now the scary story is like, even you use the cloud, you use social media, even you send, you post happily on the LinkedIn, Facebook, and all that. That also have a carbon footprint. Life is becoming so difficult. So like, I can't be locked down and then yet I can't use social media, I think I'll go crazy, right? So how do we really account for it? I really don't have an answer. But being a corporate person, I would just mainly focus on the corporate level, but we also try to influence and educate the users, how they can actually be disciplined. I tell you, I used to love shopping. Now I really cut down a lot. And also I stay away from e-commerce, because I've seen a lot of people get hooked onto it. And I'm so proud of myself. I never ordered anything last year from e-commerce. Nothing. Nice. I'm so proud of myself. Yeah. So, well, this is just my personal view. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. I mean, yeah, it's a fascinating question, frankly. I mean, you have organizations like Twitter, for example, that make these bold announcements that all of their staff can work from home permanently, if they so choose. They'll have an office, but they'll have an office space, but that remaining office space is going to be, what, 20% of 30% of what it used to be. So can they legitimately say, now that their staff are using their HVAC systems and their lighting at home instead of the office, that their carbon footprint has shrunk? And that's not a fair statement. So I think it's an emerging topic that will be discussed more, and one that we'll look forward to staying in touch and sharing on in the near future. So with just the remaining few minutes, I just want to quickly just go around to each of you, and starting with you, Carmen, and ask, when we see organizations that are working and grappling with these topics that we're talking about today, with ESG, with sustainability, with net zero, what's one thing that from your perspective, that they're doing wrong? And maybe if you want, and you want to be cheeky and flip it on its head also and say one thing they could be doing right, then we'll accept that as well. So Carmen, we'll start with you and we'll pass it to Phil. Carmen.
Sure. I think just a little bit background, that I have been with this company for more than 10 years, and I have always been one person department ever since. So I think one thing that I want to give an advice actually to companies, that like hire a sustainability manager or a team cannot solve the issue. It has to be the whole company. And I think I appreciate that I have always been one person department, is because actually every function, every department has understanding I cannot do all by myself. They take up the responsibility, and they take up that, like when they're making decision, there will be sustainability. So if they don't understand the issue, they comes to me. So I think it's very important that for companies, when they're already having someone or they're planning to hire someone, that person won't save the world. Basically, it has to be everyone. So I think this is one, I would say, interesting message that I would like to give to everyone.
I like that, and then I suppose that person ought to also be in a position to leverage their influence laterally across other functions and departments. And I, from a chief sustainability officer perspective, I'd like to ask Phil, what is that you? Are you leveraging that influence across all functions?
I'd like to hope so. I think. I'd like to sort of say, I think as an industry, and in many other allied industries, I think one of our challenges is we've all seen those little graphs. We've all seen this diminishing carbon to 2050 as the target, and the increasing CO2e, and there are all these sort of quite nice lines, but the impacts are not going to be linear. And I think you raised this, Keagan. The consequences will not be associated with that line. They're going to be episodic. And if you don't make changes and you sit the wrong side of one of those episodic fundamental changes, you're going to be in real trouble. And I think a lot of companies, and one of the big challenges I have trying to get my message over is, because we're saying 2030 or 2040 or 2050, and particularly 2050, that doesn't mean we've got this nice little incremental each year. If we get one little thing done, we've got plenty of time. Or worse still, we don't need to worry about it, because we'll sell it in 10 years' time, so it'll all be good, won't it? they are really fundamentally flawed theses, and trying to get people to realize that actually, we will see these chaotic events occur, and they will have massive repercussions to industries, to supply chains, to whatever it might be. And therefore, the urgency is not this linear urgency. It's like we need to be urgent in all of actions. And then my final other point I think I'd just like to add is, we've become really focused now on climate change, which is amazing, and it's great. It sort of links the stuff. I think we've all talking about, net zero, and we're now talking about circular economy. But I think, the bigger message that we've got to get across to people, and it sort of goes back to my environmental balance sheet, is they in themselves are not the end game. They are not the end game. They're part of a solution. And the solution is about making a resilient country, a resilient people, a resilient business, a resilient world in which we live. And so it's a bigger picture. And my fear is that when we get close enough, when we get 60% or 70%, do we start getting people going, well, that's close enough, isn't it? And the answer is no, it's not. To be truly resilient, we want to be that and more in so many different aspects. So that's my challenge. That's my problem.
Absolutely. Resilience is not just surviving, but thriving. That's excellent. And Tom, and then to Esther, and just a quick sort of 30 to 45 second tagline before we'll open it up to any questions.
Well, from my perspective, I think the thing that some companies aren't doing well enough of, and it follows on from Carmen's message, was, you have to embed this in everything you do. In other words, our roles as the sustainability group is to get the company and the people in the company to do it for themselves, not simply, solve the problem for them and then they don't have to worry about it anymore. That may have worked 5 years ago. It does not work anymore. And those companies that still think the sustainability department's got to handle all this stuff will be woefully mistaken. But we're finding that amongst our staff in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been an awakening. They found that, oh, this stuff is important, primarily because their investors are asking them about it. But now they're coming to us, whereas before you had to spoon feed it to them, and now they're asking us, hey, how do I do this? How do I do that? And it's very rewarding to see that happening these days. So.
Indeed. Yeah, I think we can see sort of a gradual awakening, and I suppose that's facilitated in large part by the fact that the actual impacts are exacerbating, and we're actually seeing what the a shrinking North and South Pole looks like, what more extreme and less predictable weather patterns look like, and how they're impacting those, especially in more vulnerable ecosystems, and in the case of, for example, oceanic levels, low-lying areas, etc., and the type of damage both to human health, but also to asset and liabilities is increasingly salient. So hopefully we
can. And not just that; it's the insurance rates are going up in those areas as well, and people notice that right away. So,
Good point. And Esther, over to you.
Okay, if I can't convince people, that you have to be passionate about it, or I can't convince you that if there's a business case, or if I can't convince you with any threats or risk, that climate risk is, business risk or investment risk, I would hit them with, like, do you have children? Do you have nephews, nieces? Do you want to live behind a world that they can survive, not just thrive, but they need to survive? Food security is a big issue. So as parent, yes, I'm scared. Okay, if you don't believe in it out of passion or love of the future, you better be act on it based on fear. So I adopt all the strategy. If I can't convince you, I will scare you. So I hope it will work.
I'm very scared, Esther. It worked on me. All right, excellent. Well, I think that we are running out of time.